The Atlantic slave trade remains one of the darkest chapters in human history. A staggering enterprise that forcibly transported millions of Africans across the ocean under unimaginable conditions. Ships were crowded beyond capacity, with enslaved men, women, and children packed tightly below deck, often chained and with barely enough room to sit or lie down. Disease spread quickly in these confined spaces, and malnutrition and dehydration were constant threats. For many, the journey became a desperate struggle for survival, with days and nights blurring together in fear, uncertainty, and pain. Beyond the physical hardships, the treatment of enslaved Africans stripped them of dignity and identity. Families were torn apart, languages and cultures suppressed, and individuals reduced to mere cargo in the eyes of traders. Yet, amid this cruelty, the human spirit persisted. Acts of resistance, defiance, and even revolt emerged, reminding us that courage and resilience can survive even in the harshest conditions. Understanding this brutal history is essential not only to honor those who suffered but to recognize the enduring impact of the slave trade on generations to come. By exploring these stories, we gain insight into the strength, courage, and humanity of those who faced unimaginable suffering. If you find this history compelling, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that uncover the truths of the past and celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. Every story matters, and your support helps keep these important narratives alive. The story of revolts aboard the ships of the Atlantic slave trade is one of both desperation and courage, born from conditions so harrowing that rebellion became, for many, the only path toward survival and dignity. From the moment enslaved Africans were forced onto these vessels, they were confined in spaces so cramped that the weight of their own bodies pressed against one another, leaving little room to breathe, sit, or even. The air below deck was thick with the stench of sweat, waste, and sickness, a constant reminder of their dehumanization. Starvation and dehydration compounded their suffering, as rations were meager, irregular, and often withheld as a means of control. The crew, armed with chains, whips, and authority, reinforced a regime of fear, inflicting punishment at the slightest perceived resistance and treating human beings as cargo rather than people. Amid this relentless oppression, the desire for freedom became a driving force. Enslaved men and women, though weakened by disease and exhaustion, held on to the vision of a life beyond the decks of these ships, imagining the forests, rivers, and villages from which they had been torn. It was this vision that fueled their courage to resist, to defy the structures of cruelty surrounding them. Even when the odds seemed insurmountable, revolts were often sparked by moments of opportunity, a lapse in the crew's vigilance, the cover of night, or the sheer force of collective determination. These uprisings required careful coordination, whispered plans, and trust among individuals who had only just been forced together under circumstances of extreme duress. The violence of revolt was met with equal brutality. Crew members, armed and trained, responded with force, often attempting to reassert control through intimidation, chains, and sometimes lethal weapons. Yet the acts of defiance were not merely about survival, they were statements of human dignity. Proclamations that despite every attempt to strip them of identity and autonomy, these individuals would not surrender their agency. Each uprising, whether successful or violently suppressed, sent waves of fear through the trade, challenging the notion that enslaved Africans were passive or compliant. Ships became battlegrounds not only of bodies but of wills, with enslaved people asserting their right to freedom in the only way they could: through resistance. These revolts were not uniform in scale or outcome. Some were brief skirmishes quickly quelled, while others, like the Amistad uprising decades later, left lasting historical echoes. Each instance revealed both the vulnerability of the traders and the resilience of those they sought to oppress, highlighting the profound tension inherent in a system built on brutality. The stories of these uprisings remind us that the human spirit, when pressed to its limits, can ignite remarkable courage and unity. Even in the depths of suffering, enslaved Africans found ways to challenge their captors, to assert control over their destiny, and to remind the world that the drive for freedom cannot be extinguished by chains. Starvation, or fear. Among the many acts of resistance during the Atlantic slave trade, certain shipboard revolts stand out for their extraordinary courage and the remarkable leadership displayed by those who refuse to accept a life of bondage. Perhaps the most famous of these is the revolt aboard the Amistad in 1839, where a group of men captives, kidnapped from their homeland in West Africa, managed to seize control of the ship that was carrying them toward Cuba. Led by Senbi, also known as Joseph Sinki, these men displayed extraordinary bravery and strategic thinking, turning their desperate situation into a calculated rebellion. They overpowered the crew, asserting their will over those who had sought to enslave them, and navigated the vessel along the treacherous waters, demonstrating not only physical courage but also remarkable leadership under extreme pressure. Their revolt would later become a symbol of resistance, inspiring abolitionists and influencing legal battles over freedom and human rights. Yet the Amistad was only one among many uprisings that shook the foundations of the slave trade. Lesser-known revolts occurred with startling frequency, often on ships whose names are now lost to history, where the determination of the enslaved to reclaim their autonomy overcame the odds stacked against them. In these smaller uprisings, leadership often emerged spontaneously, with individuals stepping forward to coordinate resistance, motivate their fellow captives, and find openings in the vigilance of the crew. These leaders understood the risks. Failure could mean immediate death, brutal punishment, or retaliation against those who survived. Still, the human desire for freedom proved stronger than fear, and in the confined and oppressive spaces below deck, these acts of rebellion became a testament to resilience, courage, and ingenuity. The strategies employed in these revolts varied widely, reflecting both opportunity and resourcefulness. Some uprisings relied on the element of surprise, striking when the crew was distracted or when the ship entered waters where rescue or navigation could be controlled by the captives. Others involved carefully coordinated efforts over days or weeks, with plans whispered among those chained together, relying on trust and solidarity forged under unimaginable conditions. The bravery displayed extended beyond the physical act of seizing weapons or overpowering guards. It encompassed the courage to imagine a life beyond enslavement and to act decisively in pursuit of that vision. Even when revolts were ultimately suppressed, the defiance itself sent ripples through the trade, instilling fear in captains and traders who realized that the people they sought to treat as cargo would not remain passive. These revolts, both famous and obscure, highlight a critical truth about the Atlantic slave trade. It was not merely a story of cruelty and oppression, but also a story of resistance and the relentless assertion of humanity. The leadership of those who organized and inspired these uprisings reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, courage and hope can flourish, transforming despair into action and fear into the determination to reclaim life and dignity. Through their defiance, these individuals challenged the entire system of oppression, leaving a legacy of heroism that continues to resonate centuries later, offering profound lessons on resilience, solidarity, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The revolts aboard slave ships were never impulsive acts of desperation. They were born of careful observation, secret planning, and remarkable courage in the face of overwhelming odds. From the moment captives were confined below deck, a few keen minds began to watch the movements of the crew, noting when guards' attention faltered, when weapons were left momentarily unattended, and how the ship's routines could be turned to advantage. In the dim, suffocating hold, where space was cramped and every movement monitored, The organization of a revolt demanded extraordinary stealth and coordination. Leaders emerged almost instinctively, individuals who could inspire trust, communicate quietly under the oppressive surveillance, and maintain morale even as fear gnawed at everyone's resolve. Plans often began with subtle acts of sabotage, loosening ropes, hiding or smuggling tools, or breaking shackles in secret, each small action building toward the moment when the captives could act collectively and decisively. When the time came to strike, the attacks were swift, coordinated, and driven by a shared understanding of risk and necessity. Groups would surge together, using their combined strength to overwhelm isolated guards, seize weapons, and take control of key points on the ship. Each movement was fraught with danger. A single misstep could invite brutal retaliation or death. But the captives pressed forward with a determination born of their refusal to remain mere cargo. The chaos of rebellion below deck often spread quickly through the vessel, as crew members scrambled to maintain control, while captives fought not just for immediate survival but for a chance to chart a course toward freedom. In some revolts, knowledge of the stars, ocean currents, or basic seamanship acquired from observing sailors or from prior experiences allowed the captives to attempt to navigate the ship themselves, turning their desperation into a daring bid for autonomy. The execution of these uprisings required more than strength. It demanded strategy, timing, and communication in a world where even the smallest sound could betray intentions. Captives relied on subtle signals, whispered instructions, and the ability to act instinctively as a unified force. Every successful move reinforced confidence, while every failure tested resolve and adaptability. Some revolts ended in tragedy, with lives lost and resistance brutally quashed. Yet even in defeat, the acts of courage revealed the resilience and ingenuity of those who refused to accept captivity quietly. The very fact that these uprisings occurred repeatedly across the Atlantic, in ships of varying sizes and conditions, speaks to the enduring spirit of resistance that coursed through the enslaved, a spirit that refused to be extinguished by chains, fear, or isolation. Through these calculated revolts, enslaved Africans transformed the seemingly hopeless conditions of the Middle Passage into arenas of agency, defiance, and assertion of identity. Each revolt was a testament to human courage and determination, a vivid demonstration that even under the most oppressive circumstances, the desire for freedom could inspire acts of extraordinary bravery and coordinated effort. These stories, whether celebrated like the Amistad or lesser known and almost lost to history, reveal the extraordinary lengths to which individuals would go to reclaim their lives and dignity. And they remind us that the struggle for freedom has always been intertwined with both intelligence and courage, resilience and strategy, hope and action. Aboard the slave ships, tension hung in the air like a thick, unrelenting fog, and the captains and crew were acutely aware that any moment, the confined and desperate human cargo could rise in revolt. Traders and sailors knew that control over the enslaved was fragile, maintained only by fear, violence, and constant vigilance. When signs of resistance emerged, a whispered plan, a hidden tool, or the restless movement of chained bodies, the response was immediate and ruthless. Armed with pistols, cutlasses, and whips, the crew enforced order with a calculated mixture of physical brutality and psychological intimidation, ensuring that any spark of defiance was met with overwhelming force. Punishments were swift and visible, designed not only to subdue the individual but also to instill fear among the others. Shackles would be tightened, flogging administered, and isolation imposed on those suspected of fomenting rebellion. Sometimes entire sections of the hold would be chained or barricaded, forcing captives into even tighter quarters, their bodies pressed against one another as a constant reminder of their powerlessness. The psychological impact was equally deliberate. Men and women were threatened, families separated, and captives were made to witness the suffering of others as a warning of what awaited any who dared resist. The tension aboard the ship was almost unbearable, a constant oscillation between moments of silence, punctuated by the crew's inspections, and sudden bursts of violence whenever disobedience or unrest was suspected. Yet, despite the oppressive atmosphere, the presence of fear could never entirely extinguish the desire for freedom. The very fact that revolts continued to occur, even under extreme scrutiny, speaks to the captives' courage and ingenuity. Crew members often had to patrol continuously, maintain armed watches through long nights, and anticipate potential uprisings by observing subtle shifts in movement or behavior below deck. They used intimidation not only as punishment but as preemptive control, attempting to make the enslaved believe that resistance was futile and that submission was the only path to survival. Despite this, the captives adapted, learning to hide tools, whisper plans, and coordinate attacks at moments when the crew's attention lapsed or when tides, darkness, or rough seas created openings for rebellion. The constant threat of violence, both real and implied, created a psychological battlefield as intense as the physical one. The crew's efforts to suppress resistance required vigilance, strategy, and ruthless efficiency, while the captives' efforts to organize and rebel required courage, secrecy, and an unyielding will to reclaim their autonomy. Each confrontation, whether an attempted revolt or a preemptive act of intimidation, heightened the tension, creating an environment where fear, hope, defiance, and survival instincts collided continuously. The interplay between oppression and resistance defined life aboard these vessels, a stark reminder that the Middle Passage was not merely a passage of bodies but a crucible of wills, where courage met cruelty, and where the human spirit, though tested to its limits, refused to be extinguished. In the end, the traders' relentless suppression and the captives' persistent defiance illustrate the profound struggle for control and freedom that characterized the Atlantic slave trade. Every act of intimidation, every lash, and every failed revolt reinforced the fragile, tense balance on board, while simultaneously revealing that even under extreme oppression, the drive for freedom could not be fully subdued. These stories illuminate the unbroken spirit of those who resisted, the relentless vigilance of those who sought to dominate, and the enduring tension that made each voyage a perilous contest between human cruelty and human courage. As revolts continued to erupt across the Atlantic, fear quietly took hold among traders, captains, and investors who had once believed absolute control was possible. Each uprising, whether widely recorded or barely noted in shipping logs, served as a warning that the system they depended on was far more fragile than they wished to admit. Ships were no longer viewed merely as vessels for transport, but as volatile spaces where control could collapse without warning. This growing anxiety reshaped every aspect of the trade, from how ships were built to how daily life aboard them was enforced, turning fear into policy and suspicion into routine. Ship design began to change in response to this persistent threat. Vessels were retrofitted with heavier iron shackles, reinforced hatches, and more rigid compartmentalization to prevent collective movement below deck. Separate decks and barriers were introduced to divide groups, limiting communication and making coordinated resistance more difficult. Narrow passageways and low ceilings were deliberately designed to restrict mobility, ensuring that any attempt to rise up would be slowed and easily contained. These architectural changes reflected a grim reality. Traders understood that resistance was not an exception, but a constant possibility, and ships were redesigned not for safety or humanity, but for surveillance and control. Security measures also intensified, transforming ships into floating fortresses. Armed guards maintained constant patrols, weapons were kept within immediate reach, and crew members were trained to respond quickly to any sign of unrest. Night watches became stricter, inspections more frequent, and routines deliberately unpredictable to prevent captives from identifying patterns they could exploit. Fear shaped every decision, as captains sought to stay one step ahead of the very people they had forced into confinement. Even moments meant for rest or basic maintenance were overshadowed by vigilance, reinforcing an atmosphere where tension never truly eased. This heightened security came at a cost, not only in resources but in morale. Traders lived with the knowledge that no amount of chains or barriers could fully erase the will to resist. Every creak of the ship, every shift of bodies below deck, carried the potential for rebellion. The psychological toll was evident in the increasingly harsh discipline imposed by crews, as fear hardened into cruelty and caution into paranoia. Yet these measures, intended to suppress resistance, often deepened resentment and desperation, creating the very conditions that made revolt more likely. The cycle fed itself, fear breeding control, and control breeding further resistance. Over time, the cumulative effect of frequent revolts began to alter perceptions of the trade itself. Insurance costs rose, voyages were delayed, and losses mounted when ships were damaged or rerotted following uprisings. Traders spoke in guarded terms about unrest and security risks, acknowledging, even if reluctantly, that the people they sought to commodify were active agents capable of challenging the system. This recognition, though rarely expressed openly, exposed a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the trade. It relied on reducing human beings to property. Yet those same individuals continually asserted their humanity through resistance. In this way, the legacy of shipboard revolts extended beyond the moments of confrontation themselves. They reshaped the physical structure of ships, the daily practices of crews, and the emotional landscape of the trade. Fear became embedded in wood and iron, in rules and routines, and in the minds of those who profited from bondage. And yet, despite all these measures, resistance never disappeared. Each revolt left an imprint, a reminder that no system built on coercion could ever achieve total control, and that the pursuit of freedom would persist, even in the most constrained and guarded spaces imaginable. When the echoes of shipboard revolts reached land, their impact did not fade with the waves, but continued to reverberate through courtrooms, newspapers, and political debates on both sides of the Atlantic. Among these moments, the case of the Amistad stands as a turning point where resistance at sea transformed into a legal and moral confrontation that challenged the foundations of the slave trade itself. After the revolt aboard the vessel in 1839, the surviving Africans were brought before American courts, where their fate became the subject of intense public scrutiny. What had begun as an act of survival on the open ocean now unfolded as a powerful test of law, justice, and humanity within a society deeply divided over slavery. The trial drew widespread attention because it forced legal systems to confront uncomfortable truths. Testimony revealed that the captives had been illegally seized, transported in violation of existing treaties, and treated as property despite international laws prohibiting such trade. Their voices, translated and heard in court, disrupted the familiar narratives used to justify enslavement. For many observers, the case exposed the contradiction between professed ideals of liberty and the reality of human exploitation. Newspapers followed every development closely, turning the courtroom into a stage where moral arguments were weighed alongside legal ones, and where the humanity of the accused could no longer be easily dismissed. As the case progressed, it galvanized abolitionist movements in both Europe and America. Activists seized the moment to highlight the broader injustice of the slave trade, using the Amistad trial as tangible proof that enslaved Africans were not passive victims, but individuals capable of reason, leadership, and moral agency. Public meetings, pamphlets, and sermons drew on the story to argue that resistance was not criminal but a natural response to unlawful captivity. The legal outcome, which ultimately recognized the captives' right to freedom, sent a powerful message that the law could be wielded against the machinery of oppression, even if only in rare and hard-won instances. The influence of the Amistad case extended beyond its immediate verdict. It emboldened abolitionists to pursue legal challenges, press for stronger enforcement of anti-slavery laws, and appeal to public conscience with renewed urgency. In Europe, where debates over the morality and economics of slavery were already underway, the trial reinforced arguments that the trade was not only inhuman but fundamentally unstable and unjust. In America, it intensified sectional tensions, exposing how deeply slavery was embedded in political and economic structures, while also offering a glimpse of how law and moral persuasion could intersect to produce change. Within the broader narrative of shipboard revolts, the Amistad trial stands as a bridge between resistance at sea and reform on land. The courage shown by those who rose up aboard the ship did not end with their survival. It reshaped conversations about freedom, legality, and human dignity across continents. Their story revealed that acts of defiance could ripple outward, influencing public opinion and legal precedent in ways that traders and oppressors could not fully contain. In this sense, the courtroom became an extension of the struggle that began below deck, transforming a single revolt into a lasting symbol of resistance and a catalyst for the growing movement to end the slave trade altogether. The legacy of slave ship revolts reaches far beyond the decks where they began, leaving a lasting cultural and historical imprint that continues to shape how we understand resistance, resilience, and human dignity. These uprisings were not isolated moments of chaos, as they were once portrayed, but powerful affirmations of humanity in the face of systematic oppression. Each act of defiance challenged the idea that freedom could be crushed by chains or that identity could be erased by violence. Together, they form a collective story of courage that stands in direct contrast to narratives that reduce enslaved people to silence or submission. Historically, these revolts exposed the deep instability of the slave trade itself. They revealed that domination required constant force and fear, and even then, control was never absolute. The memory of resistance haunted traders, reshaped laws, influenced public debate, and strengthened abolitionist movements across Europe and the Americas. Culturally, the stories of these revolts endured through oral traditions, historical accounts, and later scholarship, preserving the voices of those who refused to surrender their humanity. They remind us that resistance is not only measured by victory, but by the courage to act when the cost is high and the outcome uncertain. More importantly, these uprisings redefine how we understand resilience. Resistance aboard slave ships was not simply an attempt to escape physical confinement. It was a declaration of self-worth and moral agency. In choosing to resist, enslaved Africans affirmed that their lives had value, that their suffering was unjust, and that dignity could be asserted even under extreme oppression. These moments of collective action forged bonds of solidarity, transforming fear into shared purpose and despair into hope. Their courage challenges us to rethink history, not only as a record of suffering but as a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. Today, the legacy of these revolts continues to resonate in discussions about justice, freedom, and human rights. They serve as reminders that progress is often born from resistance, and that the struggle for dignity is universal and timeless. By remembering these stories, we honor those who stood against injustice with nothing but their will, and we acknowledge the profound impact their defiance had on the world that followed. Thank you for listening and for taking this journey through history with us. If you found this story meaningful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that explore the past, reflect on the present, and celebrate the resilience of humanity.